Good morning, it is Friday and it is the 15th of September 2023 and I'm reading out of Eyes of Horus. It is a book, a far memory book by Joan Marshall Grants. She was a writer of her incarnations or reincarnations and she passed away in 1989, but she was very famous in her time with her book Winged Pharaoh, which played 5,000 years BC. I think it was before the flood, so to speak. This one is written 2,000 years later. Eyes of Horus is about Ra-Up. She is Ra-Up in this life, a male, and she is an heir to the Nomarch of the Oryx in Egypt. This place 3,500 years BC. We are now here in part 4, chapter 7. Prisoner of Time. Young Ra-Up is traveling through Egypt to ascertain who could be a potential help in defying the corrupt system and fighting it. Prisoner of Time. The country estate of Heliokios was to the southwest of the city, and we reached it before sunset. It was not so extensive as I had expected and cannot have employed more than 100 people. The greater part of the land was given over to pasture, though I saw 3 fields under flax and perhaps twice as many in which the second harvest grain was already showing. The house was considerably larger than the one in the city, though there was no second story. The women's quarters in which the concubines lived when they were not at the other house of the 2 winds were away from the main block and sat in their own pleasure garden, surrounded by a wall. Heliokios was very proud of his oxen, of which he had developed a famous strain. They were stored in a building of their own and separated from each other by painted wooden partitions. Each stood knee-deep in fresh wheat straw, and several of them were brought for me to admire. They were magnificent beasts, their brilliant black and white hides shining like highly polished stone, and their long horns dipped with gold. The cows, which were kept for household use, were of a different breed, much smaller and reddish in colour. These were loose in a large enclosure beyond the kitchen quarters, and when I first saw them, were being led in to be milked. There was a warm smell of baking bread as we crossed the servants' courtyard, and an old woman who was pounding grain in a stone mortar, stared at me and drew her headcloth across her face as though she did not want Heliokios to notice her. The newly planted vineyard was at the back of the house, and beyond it I saw a plantation of sycamores near the ruins of a small temple. The vines showed no signs of bearing, but remembering how I had offended Heliokios over the matter of his right to plant them, I was careful to appear suitably impressed with the small green shoots. In spite of the estate being a considerable distance from the river, it was well irrigated by a wide canal, which afforded a plentiful supply of water, not only for the fields, but for a swimming pool, which was at least 3 times larger than the one in the city. It was in this pool that I was swimming soon after dawn the following morning, when I saw Daglion coming running out of the door which led from my room. I saw something serious must have happened, for usually he was careful and deliberate of movement, never displaying any emotions save those he considered fitting to be the dignity of steward of the household. "I cannot wake my master. He is lying as though he were dead, but he is still breathing. What can I do for him? I have sent a messenger to the royal physician asking him to come here with all speed. My master seemed quite well yesterday, though he complained of the heat and admitted he was unduly tired." I ran to Heliokios' room. When I saw him, I knew there was nothing we could do except wait for the physician. In the Oryx, I had seen another man whose face had had some suffusion of dusky purple. It was a soldier injured by a fall, but in his case it had been the left side of the body which had gone cold and rigid. The healer priest who attended him told me that the skull was crushed and part of the brain deeply bruised, and he had also told me that it was possible for the brain to receive a similar injury without any external cause. The soldier had died, and I was sure Heliokios was already dying. I knew that as I was his nearest blood relation, I should be expected to attend all the rites both before and after his death, never leaving his room even to sleep. He did not regain consciousness, though sometimes he tried to move his head as though he were looking for someone, and when the wrinkled lids flitted open there seemed still to be a spark of the old vitality in his eyes. I wondered if Rodin had known how difficult I should find it not to be biased in favour of a man who had been a kind and generous host, and if that was why he had thought it necessary to remind me on my last evening in HORUS-A that my loyalty to the Watchers must take precedence before all the lesser loyalties of hospitality and kinship. The royal physician with 2 attendants arrived soon after noon. I had to pretend to believe his assurances that under his care Heliokios would speedily return to health, and without protest to watch him ply his ignorant trade. Had Heliokios been someone I really loved, I think I should have forgotten discretion and sent to the Oryx for a healer, even though during the pestilence I had grown too familiar with the mark of death, not to know that nothing could keep him alive more than a few days. Life I could not have given him, but at least I could have saved him the humiliations which he suffered during his dying. I asked the royal physician if he knew what had caused the illness, and told him of the man who had also suffered from a bruised brain. I found by my question that physicians could be as jealous of their secrets as were false priests of their rituals, which was not surprising, considering they were both trying to conceal their abysmal ignorance from the fools on whose credulity they built their power. He looked at me with covert disapproval and repeated what he had told me already, that the spirit of Heliokios was being lured away from the body by a demon, which had taken upon itself the guise of a delectable concubine. Without doubt, that is the cause of his affliction, said the physician pontifically. The demon is keeping him away, and only by giving him a measure of pain can he be made aware of his peril and so restored to life. If you doubt my words, you may see for yourself that the enchantress is lying at his side and draining from it the natural warmth and vitality. That, of course, is why it has become cold and insentient. He beckoned to his assistant, who handed him a small knife, and I had to watch them score the yellow wrinkled skin with a network of fine scratches, just sufficiently deep to bead with blood. When this brought no response, they rubbed a fiery paste into the wounds. It had a sharp, acrid smell and was streaked with a pale, rusty red. This was continued at intervals from dawn of the 2nd day until noon, and when they had to admit Heliokios showed no change, they said they must now employ stronger measures. They tied up the genitals of the dying man in a bag made from the pelt of a black ram, which had been gathered just before being offering as a sacrifice. Even the most powerful spirits, they told me, cannot see whatever part of the human body is so protected. And so powerful is the effect of this shadow of invisibility that it affects the soul and spirit as well as the physical body. This remedy is only used when other methods have failed, for though it is now certain that the enchantress will release her spell, having no further use for a lover whom she will take to be a eunuch on his return, your kinsman will be forever impotent. Or should he, by powerful spells, be restored to a fleeting virility, any child born to him would be the son of the black ram. It is almost suffocatingly hot, for the physician forbade the shutters to be opened, and the only air came through a little hole which he had caused to be cut in one of them, in the shape of a mannequin with outstretched arms, through which the soul could return. At the foot of the bed a brazier was kept constantly burning. At night it was fed with bitumen and other resinous gums, to remind the spirit that if it did not return, its body would soon be in the hands of the embalmers. During the day the nauseous things which had he been able to swallow, the fortunate man would have been forced to eat, were burned in a canopic jar of the shape most commonly used to contain viscera, for the physicians held that as long as the man was breathing he received in the smoke the same benefit he would have done had his stomach been able to accept them. When I saw of what they consisted, I judged his affliction most merciful, in that it had already brought him so near the protection of death that his spirit could not suffer the indignities experienced in the flesh. Every hour of the day from dawn to sunset the brazier was replenished. At the dawn hour, lying dung moistened with honey, this to give strength. At the second hour, freshly skinned mice steeped in vinegar, for the mice can escape through the smallest crannies. At the third hour, the larvae of ants in oil, for when their nest is destroyed, ants at once begin to build it up again, and the body so strengthened will begin to recreate itself, even when deeply mutilated. At the 4th hour, a bowl of crocodile fat, for crocodiles guard the portals of the underworld, and he who has eaten of their flesh may return from the caverns for the guardians, thinking him to be one of themselves, giving him no challenge. At the 5th hour, the flesh of 3 snakes stewed in old wine, for the snake keeps in its own flesh the antidote to the most powerful poisons, even its own, and wine increases the vitality of this attribute. At the 6th hour, garlic in pigeon's blood, for the enchantress will draw back if she smells garlic on the breath of her victim, and the pigeon will give him strength to fly from her at the instant she loosens her hold. At the 7th hour, a paste made of maggots from the body of a dead vulture, for they consume that which has consumed the dead. At the 8th hour, dust from the sarcophagus of a mummified cat, black in colour, pounded in ass's cream. This will enable him to pass all magical barriers at night. The cream will purchase the aid of the dead cat and strengthen the living one. The 9th and last hour, the full-time embryo of an ape, to give him the power of renewal to the aging flesh. This was the only time they were reluctant to tell me what the jar contained. Was it only an ape? Floating in its amniotic fluid in the dim light of the brazier, it seemed the travesty of all ignorant humanity. The heavy stench was thick as rancid oil, and the gasping breath of the dying man was the only sound in the close stillness. I moved to the side of the bed and leaned over him to lift one of the thin lids. The eye was rolled back into the head and did not quiver. One side of the face was twisted, and from the corner of the mouth a little drool of saliva gathered in the hollow under the sharp collarbone. I believed that there had been a link of true affection between us. I believed that had there been a link of true affection between us, I might still have reached him and brought a measure of comfort to his restless ghost. I tried to pray that he should cross the great river in peace. The words I used seemed to have no substance, as though they were lying dormant on a papyrus, and I could feel no response flow down to me. I thought how pitiful it was for a man who had been the focus of worldly power to the dying, to be dying more friendless than the least of his servants. Smoke from the brazier coiled down like a black snake. I would have opened the windows, but to break the seals the physician had put on them would have exposed me to the charge of deliberately hastening my kinsman's death. The fetid air was now not adding to his discomfort, and I could continue to endure it. Soon after sunset, the physician came into the room, and in a low voice said that he could no longer conceal from me that his work was finished, and there was nothing I could do save to watch by Heliokios until I saw that the time had come to summon the priest who would perform the rites of the dead. His failure had cost him none of his assurance. He seemed confident that he had done everything possible, and that the inability of my kinsman to recover was due to his own perversity of spirit. He said confidently, "You must console yourself with the knowledge that nothing has been left undone. When spirits persist in a course that will lead them to death, nothing can be done to save them from the results of their folly." His voice changed from the note of former comfort that he must often have offered to the bereaved. "The priest has been informed he may be needed before dawn, so that there should be no delay. He is already in the house, and waits for you to summon him the moment the nostrils are still. Now I will leave you, for it is your privilege to watch alone during the last hours." As he turned to leave the room, he paused and said, "If the warmth of the brazier discomforts you, you may have it removed. It is no longer necessary." The lamps at the head and foot of the bed burned with a narrow, clear flame. The lungs laboured for each difficult breath like weary oxen drawing a load which soon will bring them to a standstill. The silence of the great house waited for this slow sound to join its stillness, only then to be broken by ceremonial lamentations. Minutes shuffled past like the feet of blind prisoners, and the hours they built were heavy as the drop stone of a tomb. The curtain over the doorway whispered, as though it moved in a sudden draught, and a woman crept forward through the shadows. Her eyes were fixed on the face of the dying man, and I think she never noticed I was in the room. She came slowly to the far side of the bed, and I recognized her as the woman who baked bread for the servants. She was withered and old. Her dry, colourless lips were puckered over shrunken gums, yet in her eyes was the look of a bride for her lover, and youth lived on in the cavern of her lids. She took the old man's between her own and held it against her cheek. Her voice was soft as the skin of a young girl, warm and alive. Age has come to release us, O my beloved, and the years cannot divide us any more, for the wall that life has built between us crumbles before the advancing host of death. Death has rent the veil which has obscured us from each other, and we can walk with clear eyes back into that time when the young Heliochus took the daughter of his father's servant, and they found joy together. We are young again. You have just returned from fowling, your body taut as a stretched bow, to bring down the gazelle of contentment with the arrow of desire. Your skin has the sheen of the love of Ra, and your swift thighs and lordly shoulders rejoice in their strength. And I am young, more beautiful than the fairest of your father's concubines. That is what death has brought to us, those hours when you took joy of me and gave me joy. All else is forgotten. And what has taken death? What has death taken in exchange? The tears I shed when you have forgotten me, when you no longer thought me worthy to be a concubine, even among many. The years when I had to obey the orders of other women in whom you took delight. Grinding malachite that would make more beautiful the eyes which would see you as I once had seen you. Laying gold leaf on nails whose hands would know your skin. Anointing with the perfumed oil the breasts you fondled. I took no other man and soon grew old. My hands grew clumsy and my feet were slow. I was glad when I was made a kitchen servant, for it was easier to prepare food which you might eat than to help others of your appetites. Now I bake bread for those who, like myself, are the ashes of your household. But death is taking me away. Death has gathered those weary years into his hands and crushed them into dust. Your dying breath has blown upon the wind. Time was our jailer. Time has brought down our youth and turned your strength to bitter lethargy. Now death has conquered time and bid him go, to build round other fools his palisade, which death can brush aside like summer grass. Come, my beloved, you are returning from the reeds and carry a string of 4 wild fowl. You are hurrying because I am waiting for you under the fig tree, which grows from the courtyard of the ruined temple. You have been running so hard, and it is only a little further. You can see me now, for when I heard you calling, I came out of the shadows and stood waiting in the light where you could see me. She took up the lamp and held it above her head while she leaned over him. Her voice rang out, clear and strong. I am here, Helios, waiting for you, oh my dear beloved. She stood up, straight and young, that old crippled woman. Her hands were stretched out as though she waited for the arms of her lover. Her eyes seemed to see him, standing beyond the bed, beyond the shadows. Her body crumbled as the ash of a torch crumbles when its life is consumed. I found myself standing at the window whose sealed shutters I had broken open. The moonlight was very bright, yet I could not see them, though I knew they took a path to where a fig tree had grown by a forgotten ruin. I saw she was dead before I touched her. On the lips of the dead man lingered the reflection of the smile that lit her face, the dead man whom I had thought to see die among strangers. I gathered her up. She was very light, like ancient wood, which soon will fall to dust. She must be saved the indignity of the last rites by which the body is desecrated through the rituals of an ignorant priesthood. Sorry, I think I will finish this. No, okay. She would like to be buried in the ruined temple, so that her body returned to the place where it had found joy. I wondered whose permission I must obtain to keep her from the common burial ground, and only then did I realize why the household was deferring to my authority. It was because Heliochios had appointed no other heir. And so I, who was his closest blood relation, inherited all his possessions. I was the lord of the House of the Two Winds, its herds and treasure, its lands and vineyards. I laid the woman down on a narrow couch under the window and went to find Dacleon. He was waiting in the anteroom and must have seen by my face that his master was dead, for he made low obeisance to me and then knelt to touch my instep with his forehead in sign of fealty, saying, "Your word is my law above all other law," which were the former words of the oath of obedience. I said to him, "There are 2 funerals to prepare. One tomb stands ready for its tenant, and the rituals for the last journey of his flesh are long designed. You, Dacleon, have been with Heliochios since he was a youth. Perhaps you knew that nearly 50 years ago he was the lover of a woman he seemed to have forgotten. Yet her love was the gold which time does not corrode, for only base metal perishes. The voices of the concubines will be raised in lamentation, and the women of this household will put ashes on their heads. But the voice of the only woman who loved him will be silent, for at his last breath her spirit left its body also, because there was no longer anything to hold it to earth. My kinsman's body shall be buried according to the customs by which he lived, but she is free of temporal obligations. Her body was a shackle which has been struck off, and to her the memory of its weariness is a mist that has dispersed before the sun. Though the temple is a ruin, the light there kindled still shines for those who have eyes to see. Though the tree is cut down, the voice of the leaves still speaks to those whose ears are open. There shall her body mingle with the earth, in that quiet place where love has laughed at time, and youth has vanquished age, with a quick spare of death. Dacleon followed me across the deserted courts, deserted because until the declaration of the morning had been given, all kept to their rooms. I carried the woman in my arms. Her head was turned against my shoulder as though she were weary and slept. The moon goddess, who is a compassionate to all women who suffers for their love, paved the way to her tomb with silver that the treasure of Pharaoh could not have equaled. Only a broken lotus column and part of 2 walls, which once had enclosed the courtyard, showed where the temple had been, and where the walls joined I could see the roots of a dead tree. Gently I laid her down, wrapped in my cloak. I felt as though a veil were before my eyes, and that if I could brush it aside, I could see the place as it really was, and not as by time's illusion I was seeing it. I should not be digging in bare earth under the open sky. I should not be digging in bare earth under the open sky, for here in the shade grass would be growing, and at this season the boughs above me would be dense with leaves. I worked quietly so as not to disturb the lovers who whispered together in the warm shade. They were the reality, and I had a phantom who was not yet born, a phantom without the substance of a shadow. The spade dug a narrow trench in the ground, and yet the grass was not disturbed. A phantom lifted the body of an old, tired woman, kissed her forehead before the face was shielded in the folds of a white cloak with the clasp of a gold oryx. The dry earth rustled down into the hole in the ground, sibilant as water, but the girl who lay with the joy of her lover's head between her breasts did not hear the earth, which phantoms moved to fill her grave. She was no longer a prisoner of time. If the priest, a middle-aged man wearing a white robe bordered with heavy purple, realized he had not been summoned until Heliochios had been dead nearly 3 hours, he made no sign, and without comment began rites which were as an ignorant travesty of the sealing of the body, which I had seen performed by Nefer-Ankh during the invocation to Ra. The ceremony I now watched was intended to release the spirit from the body and to protect it during its journey through the underworld. A white pigeon and a black cockerel were sacrificed on a small altar, which had been carried into the room by 2 acolytes. The blood of the white bird was supposed to protect the spirit during the hours ruled over by the sun, and of the black bird to protect during the hours ruled over, and of the blackbird to protect it when the influence of the goddess of the dark moon was predominant. With this mingled blood the body was anointed on the forehead, breast, palms of the hand, and soles of the feet. The oil I had seen used by Nefer-Ankh in the temple of the Oryx had been a vehicle of power, but the blood now used was only an empty symbol, for the one who was using it was only a man dressed in the robe of a priest. Then the mouth of the corpse was forced open. It was growing rigid in spite of the heat of the room, and on the tongue was placed a strip of papyrus, on which was written the names of the prow and the oars of the boat of millions of years, so that the spirit would know the answers to the challenge given by them on its journey. The rite used to be performed before death, said the priest. The dying man drank the ashes of a similar papyrus in a draught of wine. Then he began to pray in a loud voice, warning the spirit of Heliokios of the dangers that would beset it on its journey across the great river, and exhorting it not to listen to the voices of evil demons who would be sent to lure it to leave the boat so that they could engulf it in the waters of oblivion. Still intoning, he sealed the ears with little plugs of clay which had been freshly moistened with blood. In the same way he closed the nostrils, telling me as he did so that it was a favourite ruse of demons to disturb the newly dead by making them aware of some perfume associated with the pleasure of the flesh, the unguent used by a loved concubine, or the savour of a rich dish, so that the spirit might be tempted to return to the body. I asked why the demons bothered to resort to such devices, and was told that though the spirit is protected when it first leaves the body by those spirits whose work it is to attend the dying, if it returns of its own free will, it is then open to enslavement by the powers of darkness. While the priest was carrying out these offices, I noticed the acolytes. They were boys, not yet fully grown, their eyelids painted like women's, and their earlobes and nipples painted carmine. Had I been sufficiently familiar with the practices of the new temples, I should have known them for boys who had been given to the temple when they were 5 years old, as payment for some special favour granted to their parents by Set or Sekhmet. By a gradual process lasting for 2 years, they were sometimes rendered emasculate, or else underwent a preparation to increase their sexual ripening, similar to the one which is performed on the girls by certain Asiatic tribes. There is nothing more for me to do, said the priest. The body is now ready for the embalmer. I had forgotten that the body would have to be embalmed, and wondered if Dacleon would know who should be summoned. As though in answer to my thought, the priest said, before his departure, the royal physician informed me that immediately on his arrival at the royal city, he would tell the royal embalmer that his services were needed here. It is probable that his servant will have already arrived to take the body to the embalmer's house. I was surprised that the body would have to be taken away to be embalmed, for in the oryx that ceremony, which is only performed on those whose funerary rites are sufficiently elaborate to make it necessary to retard dissolution until they are completed, took place in the house. I asked the priest if he would take wine or other refreshment before he departed. He refused, saying he had already availed himself of mine hospitality during the hours he had waited for Heliokios to die. He stared at me with curiosity not untinged with hostility, and again I wondered if he knew that he had to wait much longer than he would have considered necessary. No doubt I shall see you again, he said, now that you are the lord of the house of the two winds. The tribute of this estate is brought to the temple to which I belong. It is less than an hour journey to the north, and was built 20 years ago, though added to more recently through the generosity of your kinsman. He must be well content that he used his treasure with such foresight, for tribute given to a temple is the only possession which can benefit a man in the hereafter. He paused and looked searchingly at me. I saw some of your bulls while I was waiting. They are worthy to make the principal sacrifice at our next festival. 5 shall be given to you, I said, in memory of my kinsman. 5, he echoed, and then added significantly, you have a large herd. You mistake me, I said 10, not 5. For the first time he smiled. Heliokios shall rest content. The sacrifice of 10 such bulls will make even the 42 assessors very lenient. After I had watched the priest depart, I found Dacleon waiting for me outside the room in which lay his dead master. The servants of the royal embalmer are here, he said. My master has arranged long ago that his body should be preserved by the one whose skill has no equal. It is usual for the one nearest to the dead man to accompany his body to the embalmer's house, so they have brought a second litter. Will you go with him? Yes, Duckling, I will go with him. And I put my hand on his shoulder, for I saw he was deep in sorrow. Wow, this was quite a long chapter, but I wanted to read it in one go. Have a lovely Friday.